The sun rose gently over the small town of Brooksville, casting a soft, golden glow across the quiet streets. In the heart of town, 12-year-old Ethan Lewis hopped onto a skateboard, the wheels rolling smoothly as he glided down the familiar sidewalks. Today felt perfect. The early breeze was crisp, and a sense of freedom filled the air. To Ethan, mornings like these were meant for little adventures. Ethan was no ordinary kid in Brooksville, though. If you ask him, he'd say he was just like any other boy. Few people knew that his father, Daniel Lewis, owned Market Point, the town's most beloved grocery store. Daniel wasn't the kind to boast or put on airs. To him, Market Point was a family legacy, something he had poured his heart into building. He taught Ethan that hard work and humility were far more important than wealth. A lesson Ethan took to heart. Today, Ethan had one mission: to get his favorite candy and a bottle of apple juice. As he entered Market Point, the familiar smells of fresh produce and baked bread greeted him, wrapping him in a warm, welcoming embrace. He grinned, making a beeline for the candy aisle. Ethan was so focused on choosing the best candy that he didn't notice the woman watching him from the other side of the store. Officer Emma Taylor was new to Brooksville, transferred from a big city with a reputation for her strict approach to law enforcement. She believed in keeping things in order, in making sure everyone knew she was in charge. Today, her gaze landed on Ethan, her expression one of suspicion. She'd seen kids like him before, at least. That's what she told herself. Ethan moved through the store with ease, oblivious to Officer Taylor's gaze fixed firmly on him. The innocence on his face was clear, but Officer Taylor didn't see that. To her, he was just another kid up to no good. As he reached for his candy, she made her way toward him, her footsteps steady, her eyes cold, unaware of the shadow approaching. Ethan picked up his candy and juice and headed toward the checkout, his mind already on his plans for the rest of the day. But then, a loud voice rang out, breaking the peaceful air. "Hey, you, what do you think you're doing?" Ethan froze, his heart pounding as he turned to see Officer Taylor glaring at him. Her eyes were sharp, unyielding, as though she had caught him in the act of committing a crime. I'm just buying some candy and juice, ma'am," Ethan replied, his voice small, the joy of the morning now dampened by a growing sense of fear. But Officer Taylor didn't look convinced. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can just take whatever you want, don't you?" she said, her tone accusing, heavy with assumption. Confusion and panic crept into Ethan's face. "No, ma'am. I have money. I was going to pay," he said, holding up the crumpled bills he'd brought along. But Officer Taylor wasn't listening. She reached out, her grip firm as she grabbed his wrist. "Shoplifting." "Huh," she muttered, shaking her head in disapproval. A few people nearby paused, watching the scene unfold. Ethan felt his cheeks burn, a mix of embarrassment and fear swelling inside him. Why was she treating him this way? Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as Officer Taylor's grip tightened around his wrist. The cheerful buzz of the store had quieted, and he felt every pair of eyes turning in his direction. Their whispers a painful reminder that he was suddenly on display. "Let go. I didn't do anything wrong," he pleaded, trying to pull back, his voice barely steady. But Officer Taylor's expression didn't soften. If anything, her face only grew more severe. "Kids these days," she muttered, a steely edge to her voice, "think they're above the law. You think you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want." Ethan's mind raced, his cheeks burning with humiliation. He glanced around, hoping anyone would speak up. But people only stared, frozen in place, torn between curiosity and discomfort. His hands, now clammy, gripped his money tightly, holding it out toward Officer Taylor. "I have the money right here. I was going to pay," he said, his voice cracking, desperate for her to believe him. But she didn't look down at the money. Her eyes remained fixed on him with an unwavering suspicion, her stance firm and immovable. She started pulling him toward the exit, ignoring his protests, her mind already made up.
Just then,
A familiar voice called out from across the store. "Officer, what's going on here?" Ethan looked up to see Mrs. Wilson, the store's longtime manager, hurrying over, her face filled with worry and confusion. She'd known Ethan since he was small, watched him grow up in the aisles of Market Point, running around and helping his dad. Mrs. Wilson's steady presence filled Ethan with a flicker of hope. "This boy was shoplifting," Officer Taylor announced, her tone cold and absolute. "Caught him red-handed." Mrs. Wilson's gaze softened as she looked at Ethan, then turned sharp as she faced the officer. "Officer, this is Ethan Lewis," she said, firmly. "He's Daniel's son. I can assure you, he wouldn't do something like that." But Officer Taylor's hand didn't release its grip. She scoffed, shaking her head slightly, as if Mrs. Wilson's words were mere noise.
"Ma'am,
"I'd advise you to stay out of this," she snapped, her tone more condescending than ever. She resumed her path toward the exit, practically dragging Ethan behind her. Ethan's skateboard clattered to the ground, forgotten in the chaos. His heart sank as he saw the looks on people's faces, some sympathetic, others judgmental. The humiliation settled deep, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He wanted to say something, to make them understand, but his voice was lost in the swirl of his emotions. As they neared the entrance, the sound of screeching tires made them pause. A sleek black car pulled up sharply in front of a store, and out stepped Daniel Lewis, his posture calm yet commanding. Though his face held a practiced calm, his eyes burned with a fierce determination. Ethan felt his father's reassuring gaze on him, and for the first time, his fear began to fade. Daniel walked over to them, stopping just a few feet away. His gaze moved from his son to the officer's hand gripping Ethan's arm. His voice was low but firm as he addressed her. "Excuse me, officer," Daniel said, his tone polite yet unyielding. "I believe you have my son." Officer Taylor looked up, barely concealing her disdain as she replied. "Stay back,
sir.
This young man has been caught shoplifting." But Daniel didn't budge. He held her gaze, calm and steady. "I'm Daniel Lewis," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "I own this store, and that's my son. I can assure you, he wasn't stealing anything." The words hung in the air, a quiet yet powerful declaration. Ethan felt a rush of pride mixed with relief as his father stood before him, unwavering, and for a moment, he began to hope that maybe this nightmare would soon be over. Daniel Lewis's words echoed through the store, carrying a weight that seemed to freeze everyone in place. Officer Taylor's grip slackened slightly, and for the first time, she looked up at him with a flicker of uncertainty. But she quickly masked it, her features hardening again. "Anyone can claim to own a store," she said, her tone dismissive. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Daniel let out a steadying breath, his eyes never leaving hers. With a calm, measured movement, he reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his ID and several business cards bearing the Market Point logo and his name. "Here's my proof," he said quietly, holding it out to her. "I've owned Market Point for 10 years, built it from the ground up, and I know my son. He wouldn't steal a thing." The crowd outside had grown, their whispers turning into a low hum. People craned their necks, peering through the glass windows, some muttering in recognition as they saw Daniel's ID. The certainty in his voice, the quiet pride in his words, there was no mistaking that he was exactly who he claimed to be. Officer Taylor's face flushed, a hint of embarrassment creeping over her features. She glanced down at the ID, then at Ethan, who was still clutching his money, eyes wide with both fear and relief. For a moment, she hesitated, her authority wavering in the face of the truth. But instead of releasing Ethan, she tightened her grip once more, her face hardening. "Kids these days," she muttered, almost to herself. "They think they're above the law. Just because you're his father doesn't mean I don't have the right to handle this as I see fit." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd, the discontent rising as people recognized Daniel, a respected figure in Brooksville. Someone in the back called out, "Leave the boy alone. He's done nothing wrong." Another voice chimed in, "That's Ethan Lewis, he's no thief." The officer glanced at the crowd, her jaw tightening as their judgmental stares weighed on her. But still, she held her ground, unwilling to admit defeat. Daniel's calm didn't falter. He took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "Officer," he began, his tone respectful yet firm, "I understand that you're doing your job, but there has been no crime here. My son doesn't deserve to be treated like this, especially not without cause." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a rising tide of support behind Daniel and Ethan. It was clear that the town stood with them, recognizing the unfairness of the situation. At last, Officer Taylor's resolve seemed to crack. With a frustrated sigh, she released Ethan's arm, her face a deep shade of red. "Fine," she muttered, her voice tight, "but I'll be keeping my eye on him." Ethan let out a shaky breath, rubbing his wrist where her fingers had pressed into his skin. He looked up at his father, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. But Daniel's expression remained calm and steady, his hand gently resting on Ethan's shoulder. "Go inside with Mrs. Wilson, son," Daniel said quietly, his voice soothing. Ethan gave him a small nod and, without another word, headed back into the store, his heart still pounding but his spirit lifted by his father's unwavering support. As Ethan disappeared into the store, Daniel turned to face Officer Taylor, his gaze steady. "This isn't how we treat people in this town, officer," he said, his voice calm but with a subtle edge that commanded respect. "We treat everyone fairly, with respect. That's what Brooksville is about." Officer Taylor's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but as she glanced around at the crowd, she could feel the weight of their judgment. Their disapproving stares bore into her, a silent condemnation of her actions. She shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how out of place her approach had been in this close-knit town. With a final glare at Daniel, she turned and made her way back to her squad car. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the sense that she had made a grave mistake. The eyes of the townspeople followed her, and for the first time, she felt the sting of her own actions. Daniel watched her go, his expression calm but unyielding. He knew that his son had learned a valuable lesson today, not just about standing up for himself, but about the quiet strength that comes from patience and dignity. And as he turned to follow Ethan back into the store, he felt a renewed determination to protect his family, no matter the challenges they might face. The incident spread through Brooksville like wildfire. By evening, nearly everyone in town had heard about what had happened at Market Point, about the officer who had accused young Ethan Lewis of theft and the calm, unwavering presence of his father, Daniel, who had stood by his son in front of everyone. The talk echoed in homes, cafes, and along sidewalks, a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and support. Officer Emma Taylor, however, wasn't as unfazed as she'd hoped to be. She spent the rest of her shift with a gnawing discomfort, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She had done everything by the book, hadn't she? But when she closed her eyes, the look on Daniel Lewis's face, the way he'd held his head high, the conviction in his voice as he defended his son, lingered with her. By the next morning, Emma received a message summoning her to the police station, and her pulse quickened with dread. The call had come from Chief Samuel Morris himself. Her superior had never been one to mince words, and Emma could already anticipate the reprimand that awaited her. Her hand shook slightly as she pushed open his office door and stepped inside. Chief Morris sat behind his desk, a stern yet disappointed expression on his face. He gestured for her to sit, and Emma complied, her spine straight, bracing for impact. "I've been hearing some things about yesterday, Officer Taylor," he began, his voice measured, "about an incident at Market Point involving Daniel Lewis's son." He looked her in the eye, holding her gaze steadily. "Is it true that you accused a young boy of shoplifting without any evidence?" Emma hesitated, her throat suddenly dry. She wanted to defend herself, to say she had been following protocol. But the judgment in Chief Morris's eyes held her silent. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping just a little.
Yes, sir.
I thought I was doing what was right. Chief Morris leaned forward, clasping his hands together.
Emma.
You've been here only a short time, but you need to understand something about this town. Brooksville isn't like the places you may have served before. Here, we protect everyone, not just those we think deserve it at a glance. We're here to build trust, to make people feel safe, not to humiliate them without cause. The words stung, and Emma's face grew hot with shame. But still, she felt a twinge of resistance.
Sir.
I thought I was following procedure. Sometimes kids do think they can get away with things. Chief Morris's gaze hardened. Procedure is one thing, but this was Daniel Lewis's son. You're talking about a well-respected family, a boy with no history of trouble. You should have known better. Or, at least given him the benefit of the doubt. Instead, you made him feel like a criminal. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her tongue. The truth of Chief Morris's words weighed heavily on her. She'd come to Brooksville wanting to prove herself, to show she could handle whatever came her way. But in her eagerness, she'd gone too far. Let her assumptions get the best of her. Chief Morris sighed, his voice softening.
Emma.
We all make mistakes, but this is one you need to own. I want you to go to Market Point and apologize to Mr. Lewis and his son. Sincerely. That's how we start to make things right in this town. Emma felt her stomach twist. An apology? She'd never had to apologize in uniform before. The thought of facing Daniel Lewis and Ethan after what she'd put them through made her skin prickle with dread. But as she looked into Chief Morris's eyes, she knew she didn't have a choice. Brooksville was a place of accountability. A place where everyone was expected to make amends, no matter their position. With a nod, Emma rose to her feet.
Yes.
Sir, she said quietly, her voice subdued. I'll apologize. Chief Morris gave her a brief nod, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Good. Remember, respect isn't something we demand from this community. It's something we earn. As Emma left his office, she took a deep breath, preparing herself for the task ahead. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Officer Emma Taylor pulled into the parking lot of Market Point. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her pulse quickening with every passing second. This wasn't a routine call. It wasn't an arrest, a report, or a lecture on safety. It was an apology, a public admission of her mistake. She knew that in a town like Brooksville, word of her visit would spread fast, and this encounter would likely be talked about for days to come. She took a deep breath, adjusted her uniform, and stepped out of her car. The weight of her badge felt heavier than usual, as if it,
too,
was somehow disappointed in her. She could already see a few familiar faces in the store window, watching her approach with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Emma forced herself to focus, keeping her gaze steady as she made her way to the entrance. Inside, the store was quiet, almost as if everyone had paused to witness what would happen next. Daniel Lewis and Ethan were at the far end of the store, stacking boxes together. Their laughter drifted through the aisles, and Emma felt a pang of discomfort. Ethan looked so carefree, his smile wide as he chatted with his father, the weight of yesterday's ordeal seemingly forgotten, or perhaps tucked away, hidden beneath the surface. Clearing her throat, Emma stepped closer, the sound catching their attention. Ethan's laughter faded, and his body tensed slightly as he looked up and saw her standing there. A flicker of fear crossed his eyes before he steadied himself, his gaze darting to his father as if seeking silent reassurance. Daniel placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, offering a calm, grounding presence. His eyes met Emma's, unreadable yet composed, a quiet strength in his gaze that made her feel both intimidated and oddly relieved. Mr. Lewis. Ethan, she began, her voice softer than she'd intended. I came here today because I owe you both an apology. Ethan glanced at his father, confusion and guarded curiosity on his face. Daniel gave him a small nod, silently encouraging him to listen. He then turned his full attention to Officer Taylor, his gaze steady and unwavering, waiting for her to continue. Emma felt the weight of that look, the quiet demand for sincerity. "I was wrong to accuse you, Ethan," she said, meeting his eyes. "I assumed the worst without any evidence.
I
I didn't mean to make you feel like you didn't belong or that you weren't welcome here." Ethan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he glanced at his father, who offered him a small, reassuring smile. Daniel's gaze softened as he looked back at Officer Taylor. "Thank you, officer. It's important to admit when we've made mistakes." His voice held no bitterness, no anger, only a calm acceptance that somehow made her feel both humbled and grateful. Emma swallowed, feeling a surge of relief, mixed with guilt. She realized just how much grace this family was offering her, even after what she'd put them through. They weren't holding grudges or demanding more. They simply wanted fairness, respect, the very things she was meant to uphold. "If there's anything I can do to make it up to you," Emma offered, feeling the need to do something more, something tangible.
Daniel shook his head gently.
"What's done is done, Officer Taylor. Just remember this moment," he said, his tone kind but firm. "Respect isn't something you demand from people. It's something you earn." Emma felt the truth of his words settle into her, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She nodded, swallowing the tightness in her throat. "I understand. Thank you for the chance to make things right." As she turned to leave, she noticed Ethan's expression had softened, a small spark of trust beginning to form in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. Exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something better. Something she hoped she could earn with time. Stepping outside, Emma felt the warmth of the sun on her face, a weight lifting from her shoulders. In the weeks that followed, she made a conscious effort to get to know the people of Brooksville better, learning their stories and understanding the close bonds that held the town together. Little by little, her actions began to reflect the humility and respect she had learned that day, leaving behind the hardened approach she'd once clung to. For Ethan,
too,
the experience left a lasting impact.
He saw
firsthand that his father's strength didn't come from anger or pride, but from patience and wisdom. And as he looked up at his father, he understood that he was protected not only by his father's love, but by his own courage to stand up for what was right. And in the heart of Brooksville, a quiet transformation had begun, rooted in understanding,
respect,
and the simple power of an apology. Brooksville was a small town, the kind where news traveled faster than a summer breeze. By the time Officer Emma Taylor's apology had ended, whispers of the incident had spread to every corner, from the bustling diner downtown to the small barbershop on Main Street. People spoke in hushed voices, piecing together what they had seen or heard, each retelling adding a touch of their own opinion. The town was divided. Some residents defended Officer Taylor, saying she was simply doing her job, enforcing rules and ensuring that the town stayed in order. They argued that it was a minor misunderstanding, nothing to fuss over. But others saw the incident for what it was, an unjust accusation that had put an innocent boy in harm's way.
To them,
the incident revealed something deeper, a prejudice that didn't belong in Brooksville. Among those paying close attention was an older woman named Mrs. Grant, a longtime resident who had known Daniel and Ethan for years. She had watched Ethan grow up, often seeing him helping his father around the store.
To her,
the accusation against him felt personal, an insult not just to the boy but to the entire community. Mrs. Grant decided she wouldn't let this go unnoticed. She wrote a letter to the local newspaper, sharing her thoughts on what had happened, her words a mix of anger and sorrow. "We're a town that prides itself on unity," she wrote. "We don't judge our neighbors based on where they're from or what they look like. We respect each other because we're all part of this community." Her letter struck a chord. Over the next few days, more letters began to appear in the newspaper, with residents voicing their thoughts on the incident. Some called for more accountability within the police force, suggesting that the officers should undergo training to understand the community better. Others pointed out the importance of recognizing bias and breaking down harmful assumptions before they led to more incidents like this. The Brooksville Police Department
2.
was feeling the effects of the backlash. Chief Samuel Morris found his office flooded with calls and messages, each demanding answers, explanations, or changes. The pressure mounted with each passing day, the normally quiet station now buzzing with tension. One evening, Chief Morris called Officer Taylor into his office. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing full well the gravity of the situation. Her steps were heavy as she walked down the corridor. The familiar sounds of the station, ringing phones, chatter, suddenly feeling distant, as if they were miles away.
Emma.
"Have a seat," Chief Morris said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His tone was calm, but his eyes were troubled. Emma sat down, clasping her hands in her lap, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She had been a cop for years, yet she had never felt this vulnerable, this exposed. She had always believed in doing things by the book, in keeping order.
But now,
the events of the past few days had left her questioning everything. "Emma," the chief began, folding his hands on his desk, "I've been receiving a lot of feedback from the community. People are upset, and they have every right to be. You're not just an officer enforcing the law, you're a part of this community. And that comes with a responsibility." Emma nodded, her throat tightening. "I understand,
sir.
I know I made a mistake, and I've apologized to Mr. Lewis and his son." Chief Morris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "An apology is a good start."
Emma.
"But an apology alone isn't enough. People want to know that this won't happen again. They want to know that their police force sees them as individuals, as people, not as suspects." His words hit her hard, and she realized just how deep the damage went. Her actions had shaken the town's trust, a trust that had taken years to build and could be shattered with a single moment of prejudice. The chief continued, "I'm enrolling you and the rest of the department in a community relations program. It's going to involve training in understanding biases, connecting with the community on a personal level, and building trust. It's not just for you, Emma, it's for all of us. We need to do better." Emma's pride flared for a moment, the instinct to defend herself rising. But she quickly let it go. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I understand,
Chief.
I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Chief Morris gave her a small, encouraging nod.
Good.
"Because that's what Brooksville deserves. People need to feel safe here. Emma, not judged, not looked down upon. This is their home, and we're here to protect that." As she left his office, Emma felt both humbled and determined. She realized this wasn't just a matter of keeping her job or making a public apology. It was about changing her perspective, understanding the people she had sworn to serve, and finding a way to build trust with them again. And across town, in their small home, Daniel and Ethan sat down for dinner, their table a quiet sanctuary amid the town's brewing storm. Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you think she meant it?" he asked, his voice soft. Daniel met his son's gaze, a gentle smile on his face. "I think she's learning, son. Sometimes it takes a mistake to show us the right way forward." As they ate, a feeling of quiet hope settled over them, a sense that maybe, just maybe, Brooksville would come out of this stronger. A town that stood by each other, united in understanding, respect, and the courage to change. In the days following her conversation with Chief Morris, Officer Emma Taylor committed herself to change, determined to make amends and to earn back the trust of the town she'd wronged. She began to spend her off-duty hours in Market Point, offering to help with groceries, carrying bags to cars,
And,
occasionally, sharing a smile with customers she once overlooked. At first, many people met her gestures with polite silence, but gradually, her presence began to feel less like an intrusion and more like an attempt to truly connect. One Saturday morning, just a few weeks after the incident with Ethan, Market Point was bustling. It was the weekend before Thanksgiving, and townspeople hurried through the aisles, filling their carts with holiday essentials. Emma was at the front of the store, wearing a simple jacket instead of her police uniform, a subtle choice that felt right. She helped an elderly man with his bags, then walked over to where Ethan was stocking shelves. Ethan paused, looking up as she approached. Though the initial tension had softened, a trace of guardedness remained in his eyes. She noticed it, but didn't let it deter her. She offered him a small, genuine smile, and he nodded back, cautious but polite.
Hey, Ethan, she said.
Her tone light but sincere. I was wondering if you'd mind if I gave you a hand today. Maybe even learn a few tips from you about running a store. Ethan blinked in surprise, then shrugged, trying to hide a small smile.
Sure.
I guess. Just don't mess up the candy display. It's a favorite around here. Emma chuckled, her relief evident. She spent the morning restocking shelves with him, asking him questions about the store, about his father's journey, building it up, and about what he wanted to do when he grew up.
For the first time.
She wasn't Officer Taylor the cop. She was just Emma, the woman who was trying to understand and connect. As the day wore on, customers started to notice. A few exchanged glances, eyebrows raised as they saw Emma working alongside Ethan, laughing and chatting with him like old friends. Word of the incident between Emma and Ethan had spread through Brooksville like wildfire, and many of those watching had been among the crowd who'd witnessed her wrongful accusation. To see her here, voluntarily helping the boy she had once misjudged, was both unexpected and strangely satisfying. By midday, Daniel Lewis arrived, pushing a cart with a fresh delivery of produce. He noticed Emma and Ethan working together, a small smile playing on his face as he watched his son laugh, the trace of caution finally slipping away. Daniel approached them, his voice warm.
Well,
"This is a sight I didn't expect to see," he said, nodding to Emma. "Good to see you lending a hand, officer." Emma stood up, brushing her hands off. "Mr. Lewis," she greeted him with a nod, her tone respectful.
actually, today.
"I'm just Emma. No badge. No title, just here to help out." Daniel looked at her, his face softening with appreciation. "Thank you," he said simply, the sincerity in his words carrying a depth that made her feel both humbled and grateful. As the afternoon continued, Emma noticed that people were beginning to warm to her presence. A few customers exchanged polite greetings with her, and some even smiled as they passed by. Her gesture was small, but it was a start, a sign that maybe, slowly, the walls she had built between herself and the community were beginning to come down. Toward the end of the day, as Emma and Ethan finished organizing the last of the shelves, a young girl approached them.
She was clutching a small toy,
her eyes wide with wonder as she looked at Emma in her casual clothes, her police uniform nowhere in sight. "Are you a friend of Ethan's?" the girl asked, her innocent question catching both of them off guard. Emma hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who looked at her with a shy, almost hopeful smile. She nodded, her voice soft as she replied,
Yes.
"I am. I'm his friend." The girl smiled,
Pleased.
and skipped away, leaving them both in a comfortable silence. Ethan glanced down, fiddling with the corner of a cardboard box. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper.
For.
"You know, everything." Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She realized then that her journey toward redemption was far from over. But this moment with Ethan was a reminder of how much had already changed. She'd started to see the people of Brooksville not as potential suspects, but as neighbors, as friends, as a community that had opened its doors and allowed her to find her place in it. As she walked out of Market Point that evening, the sun setting low over the town, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. Her past mistakes no longer felt like a heavy weight, but like stepping stones, guiding her toward becoming the officer she had always wanted to be, one who served with empathy, understanding, and a respect that didn't need to be demanded. And in Brooksville, a quiet shift was taking place. Neighbors spoke of Officer Taylor's transformation with a mixture of surprise and admiration. They'd watched her break down the invisible walls that had once separated her from the people she was meant to serve. And though the past couldn't be erased, it had shaped a future in which Officer Emma Taylor stood not just as a protector, but as a friend. The crisp morning air held a feeling of quiet renewal as Officer Emma Taylor walked through Brooksville's main square. She nodded warmly at familiar faces, exchanging greetings and stopping to chat. People now knew her not only as the officer who had once made a grave mistake, but as someone who had genuinely sought to mend the bonds she had broken. Her journey hadn't been easy, and she knew it wasn't over. She was still learning, still working to bridge the gap between duty and understanding. But with each new connection, each simple act of kindness, she felt herself becoming more rooted in the town. Brooksville had stopped feeling like an assignment, a place to manage. It was becoming a home. As she neared Market Point, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the entrance, where a large sign read, "Community Day at Market Point." Balloons in bright colors bobbed gently, and tables were set up with homemade pies, fresh apples, and small crafts made by local families. Daniel and Ethan stood at the center, chatting with neighbors and laughing as they helped arrange everything. They looked up and spotted her, their faces breaking into welcoming smiles. "Emma," Ethan called, waving her over enthusiastically. Emma felt her heart swell as she approached them, surprised by how natural it felt to be part of this gathering. She smiled, her nervousness fading as she joined the crowd. Daniel nodded at her with a warm expression that seemed to say he was proud of how far she'd come. "Glad you could make it," Daniel said. "We've been planning this for weeks. Thought we'd bring everyone together, show a little Brooksville spirit." Emma nodded, looking around at the joyful faces and feeling a sense of gratitude for being invited to be a part of it all. "It's a great idea," she replied, scanning the bustling crowd. "Seems like the whole town turned out." They shared a quiet moment, watching as kids played, families gathered, and friends reconnected. Emma spotted a few people who had been there the day she'd accused Ethan. People who had been skeptical of her at first, but who now greeted her with open smiles. She'd come to know many of them, hearing their stories, understanding their struggles. The town wasn't just a place she patrolled anymore. It was a tapestry of lives she'd grown to respect and care for. "Officer Taylor," a small voice called out, pulling her attention. It was the young girl she had met during her first day volunteering at Market Point, her wide eyes now filled with excitement. "Look what I made." She held up a simple bracelet, colorful beads strung together with a little charm dangling at the end. Emma knelt down, examining the bracelet with genuine admiration. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice warm. "You did an amazing job." The girl grinned, her cheeks flushing with pride. "It's for you," she said, slipping it onto Emma's wrist. "So you can remember us." Emma's heart swelled as she looked down at the bracelet, the beads bright against her skin.
"Thank you," she said,
her voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure it." As she rose, Daniel leaned in, his voice soft. "Looks like you're officially part of the community now, Emma." She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't known she'd needed. "I think I finally understand what you meant about respect, Mr. Lewis. It's not about power or control. It's about being here for people, listening to them, standing beside them." Daniel nodded, a glimmer of pride in his eyes.
"Exactly, Emma."
"And you've done that." Ethan, who had been watching the exchange, spoke up.
"So,
"Does this mean you're going to help us today, officer?" he teased, a playful grin lighting up his face. Emma laughed, nodding. "Absolutely. Where should I start?" The rest of the day passed in a joyful blur. She helped hand out snacks, cheered at the small games the children played, and even joined in a round of sack racing. Every now and then, she'd glance down at the bracelet on her wrist, reminded of the simple yet powerful journey she'd undertaken, of the small steps that had brought her to this moment. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the square, the crowd slowly started to disperse. Emma lingered with Daniel and Ethan, watching as the last few families waved goodbye. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a peace that wrapped around her like the warmth of the evening light. Just before she left, Daniel turned to her, his hand extended. "Emma," he said,
his voice steady.
"thank you for everything, for listening, for being here, and for becoming someone we can rely on." She took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you, Daniel, for giving me the chance to make things right." As she walked back to her car, the bracelet tinkling softly on her wrist, she knew her life had forever changed. She was no longer just Officer Taylor, enforcing rules and keeping order. She was Emma, a part of Brooksville, a town that had taught her the true meaning of respect, belonging, and community. And as she drove away, she glanced back at Market Point, a gentle smile on her face, knowing she was already looking forward to the next day, the first of many new beginnings.